Last time, Marshall Field gave Orison Marden an afternoon and a pencil and did the thing almost no merchant will do in public. He showed his arithmetic. 30 years of it, worked out over the counter of a dry goods house on State Street, and every figure already tested by fire. Now hold this number in your head, $3.5 million. That is what burned out of Field's business on a single night in October of 1871. The entire stock, the fixtures, the building, the street it stood on. He was insured. And then he discovered something worse than being uninsured. Several of the companies that held his policies had been burned out of existence themselves. The paper was good. The insurers were ash. And when Marden asked him, plainly, whether he had ever suffered a loss or a reverse in his whole career, Field answered like a man reading a balance sheet aloud. No loss. Except the fire. That is not bravado. That is a man who structured a business so that catastrophe was the only thing that could touch it, because he had already made sure that credit could not. This is part 2. This is not a history lesson. This is Marden's private notebook, opened at the P where Field is still talking.
I am still in the private office, Selfridge's office, his most trusted lieutenant, and the room is Selfridge's, but the voice in it is Field's. He answers slowly. He does not fill silence. I ask him about the house, about the name over the door and how it changed. Palmer withdrew, he says, and until 1881, the style of the firm was Field, Leiter and Company. Mr. Leiter retired in that year, and since then it has been as at present. Marshall Field and Company. 3 names on that door in a working lifetime. 2 of them gone. He says it the way another man tells you the time. I ask the question I came to ask. What contributed most to the great growth of your business? To answer that question, he says, would be to review the condition of the West from the time Chicago began until the fire in 1871. Everything was coming this way. Immigration, railways, water traffic. Chicago was enjoying flush times. Understand what he means by that. He is not describing weather. He is describing a river of people and freight pouring into one point on a map, and every one of them needing cloth, needing thread, needing boots, needing to be sold to on terms. There were things to learn about the country, he says, and the man who learned the quickest fared the best. Then he gives me the example, and the example is the whole of it. The comparative newness of rural communities and settlements, he says, made a knowledge of local solvency impossible. Read that again slowly. A knowledge of local solvency. Impossible. Out there, past the last railhead, is a storekeeper in a town that is 18 months old. He wants $400 of goods on time. Who is he? What does he owe? Who else is he owing it to? Nobody knows. There is no answer to be had. The town did not exist when the last ledger was ruled, and over the top of that, he says, the old state banking system prevailed, and speculation of every kind was rampant. The old state banking system. That means the paper in the till is not one currency. It is dozens. Notes from banks in 3 states, each discounted at a different rate, some of them worth their face, some of them worth what the man who takes them can get. You are selling unknown goods buyers on credit you cannot verify, and being paid in money whose value you must guess. That is Chicago before the war. Then 1857 comes. The panic of 1857, he says, swept almost everything away, except the house I worked for. Except the house I worked for. He is a clerk then. He is not the owner of anything. He is a young man from Massachusetts, standing in a wholesale house watching the entire trade of a city go down around him. And his employer does not go down. and he does what almost nobody does in a panic. He asks why. And I learned, he says, that the reason they survived was because they understood the nature of the new country and did a cash business. That is, he says, they bought for cash and sold on 30 and 60 days, instead of giving the customers, whose financial condition you could hardly tell anything about, all the time they wanted. That is the entire mechanism. Buy for cash, sell for 30 days, 60 at the outside. When the panic came, he says, they had no debts and little owing to them, and so they weathered it all right. No debts, little owing to them. Those are the two sentences that make a house immortal in a country where nobody can be verified. Around him, the houses that extended 6 months and 9 months and 12 months of credit to unknown men in unknown towns are being carried off. Not because they sold badly. They sold beautifully. They sold everything they had to people who could not pay. Field says it plainly, and the sentence lands in the room like a weight on a counter. I learned what I consider my best lesson, he says, and that was to do a cash business. He is a young clerk. He has just watched a city die of its own accounts receivable, and he has taken the only lesson that matters, and he will not let go of it for 50 years. I ask him what principles he applied to his own business when it became his own, and he stops being a survivor of a panic and becomes something colder. He becomes a rule maker. I made it a point, he says, that all goods should be exactly what they were represented to be. He does not say it as a sentiment. He says it as a policy of the house, and I write it down as a policy of the house. It was a rule of the house, he says, that an exact scrutiny of the quality of all goods purchased should be maintained. Purchased, not sold. Scrutinized on the way in, and that nothing was to induce the house to place upon the market any line of goods at a shade of variation from their real value. A shade of variation. That is his phrase. Not a fraud, not a swindle, a shade. Every article sold, he says, must be regarded as warranted, and every purchaser must be enabled to feel secure. Feel secure. Consider what that means on a balance sheet, because it means something exact. If a purchaser must feel secure, then the goods can come back. If the goods can come back, the house eats the loss. And if the house eats the loss, then the only way to survive is to make sure the loss almost never happens. At the buying end, on the inspection table, before a cent is committed. The guarantee at the front of the store is paid for by the scrutiny at the back of the warehouse. That is not kindness. That is a closed system. And it does the same work as the cash rule. It removes uncertainty from the transaction. The customer in Iowa cannot verify Field. Field cannot verify the customer in Iowa. So Field takes both unknowns out of the deal. His goods are warranted, and his terms are 30 days. Neither side has to trust. Both sides can transact. Then I ask him the question every man in this country wants the answer to. Did you suffer any losses or reverses during your career? No loss, he says, except by the fire of 1871. It swept away everything, he says. About $3.5 million. $3.5 million. Stock, fixtures, premises, the street itself. In one night, in a wind. We were, of course, protected by insurance, he says, which would have been sufficient against any ordinary calamity of the kind. Any ordinary calamity. Hold on to that phrase, because here is the part that ruins men who thought they were covered. But the disaster was so sweeping, he says, that some of the companies which had insured our property were blotted out. blotted out. The insurer is gone. The policy is a piece of paper describing a promise made by a corporation that no longer exists. And a long time passed, he says, before our claims against others were settled. So there it is, the greatest merchant in the West, holding a fistful of claims, waiting on adjusters, with no store, no stock, and no street. And here is why the cash rule was worth what it was worth. He owes nobody. Nobody can call on him while he waits. We managed, however, to start again, he says. Start again. 3 words for the hardest winter in the city's history. There were no buildings of brick or stone left standing, he says. But there were some great shells of horse-car barns at State and 20th Streets which were not burned. And I hired those. A car barn, straw on the floor, and the smell of horses in the boards. That is the temporary home of a $3.5 million business. We put up signs, he says, announcing that we would continue business uninterruptedly. Uninterruptedly. That word is the whole strategy. Every customer from here to the Missouri River is at this moment asking one question: is field finished? And the answer goes up in paint on a horse-car barn within days. And then, he says, we rushed the work of fitting things up and getting in the stock. He tells me later, almost in passing, that after the fire of '71, he worked about 18 hours a day for several weeks. He does not offer it as a boast. He offers it as an exception, and he wants it understood as an exception. Then I ask him about 1873, the panic that came 2 years later and took down Jay Cook and closed the exchange and emptied the trade of half the country. Did the panic of 1873 affect your business? Not at all, he says. Not at all. And then 5 more words, and they are the same 5 words from 1857, worn smooth by 16 years of use. We did not have any debts. Twice now. 2 national panics, 16 years apart, and the same answer both times. So I ask him for the point, the exact point, the turning point in his career, the point after which there was no more danger. And his answer has nothing to do with the fire, or the store, or the West. Saving the first $5,000 I ever had, he says, when I might just as well have spent the moderate salary I made. That is the answer, not the fire, not the partnership, not the day the name went up over the door. A clerk's salary, in a rented room, not spent. Possession of that sum, he says, once I had it, gave me the ability to meet opportunities. That I consider the turning point. The ability to meet opportunities. Listen to how a merchant says that. He does not say the money made him rich. He says it made him able to answer when something was offered. In this country, a man is offered a partnership perhaps twice in his life. The offer does not wait. If the $5,000 is not sitting there in hand on the day the offer is made, the offer goes to the next man, and there is no appeal. Field had it sitting there. That is the whole of his turning point, and he will not dress it up. I ask what trait of character he looks upon as having been most essential in his career. Perseverance, he says. And here, Mr. Selfridge, in whose private office we are sitting, will not let it stand. He insists upon the addition of good judgment. His most trusted lieutenant, correcting him in front of a stranger with a notebook. And Field lets it stand. If I am compelled to lay claim to such traits, Field says, it is because I have tried to practice them, and the trying has availed me much. I have tried to make all my acts and commercial moves the result of definite consideration and sound judgment, he says. Then the line that ought to be carved over the door of every counting house in Chicago. There were never any great ventures or risks. Never any great ventures or risks. from the largest merchant west of the Alleghenies, in the most speculative city in America. I practiced honest, slow-growing business methods, he says, and tried to back them with energy and good system. Slow-growing. Energy. Good system. There is no fourth thing. He disclaims having overworked. I press him on it, because of the 18 hours after the fire, and he separates the two things carefully. My fortune, he says, has not been made in that manner. I believe in reasonable hours, he says, but close attention during those hours. I never worked very many hours a day. And then he says something I did not expect from a man of his generation, and I write it down exactly. People do not work as many hours now as they once did, he says. The day's labor has shortened in the last 20 years for everyone. He states it as a fact of the country, not as a complaint about it. I ask him the beginner's question, the first requisite for success in life, so far as the young beginner is concerned. The qualities of honesty, energy, frugality, integrity, he says, are more necessary than ever today, and there is no success without them. Then he anticipates the objection before I can make it. They are so often urged, he says, that they have become commonplace. But they are really more prized than ever. And any good fortune that comes by such methods, he says, is deserved and admirable. I ask about college, whether a college education is a necessity for the young man's future. His answer is the sharpest thing he says all afternoon. Not for business purposes, he says. Better training will become more and more a necessity. But not that. The truth is, he says, with most young men, a college education means that just at the time when they should be having business principles instilled into them and be getting themselves energetically pulled together for their life's work, they are sent to college. Then intervenes, he says, what many a young man looks back on as the jolliest time of his life. 4 years of college. Often when he comes out of college, Field says, the young man is unfitted by this good time to buckle down to hard work, and the result is a failure to grasp opportunities that would have opened the way for a successful career. Unfitted by the good time. That is the merchant's verdict, and he does not soften it. Then I ask him about the end of it, about retiring, and the temperature of the room changes. I do not believe, he says, that when a man no longer attends to his private business in person every day, he has given up interest in affairs. He may be, in fact should be, doing wider and greater work. There certainly is no pleasure in idleness, he says. A man, upon giving up business, does not cease laboring, but really does, or should do, more in a larger sense. He should interest himself in public affairs. And then this. From a man with one of the largest private fortunes in the United States, sitting in his own building, on his own street. There is no happiness in mere dollars. After they are acquired, he says, one can use but a moderate amount. It is given a man to eat so much, to wear so much, and to have so much shelter. And more he cannot use. When money has supplied these, he says, its mission, so far as the individual is concerned, is fulfilled. And man must look further and higher. Its mission is fulfilled. He speaks of a fortune the way an engineer speaks of a completed bridge. It has done the work it was built to do. Now what? It is only in the wider public affairs, he says, where money is a moving force toward the general welfare, that the possessor of it can possibly find pleasure, and that only in constantly doing more. I ask him the last question. What, in his estimation, is the greatest good a man can do? The greatest good he can do, says Mr. Field, is to cultivate himself, develop his powers, in order that he may be of greater use to humanity. That is the end of it. He rises. Selfridge shows me the door of his own office. Out on the floor, the gas is up, and the counters are still working, and there is not one man among the hundreds down there who would guess that the proprietor has just spent an afternoon telling a stranger that money's mission ends at food, clothes, and a roof. I go down the stairs and out into State Street with the notebook in my coat, and the whole of it fits on 9 pages. Cash. Warranted goods. $5,000 saved. No debts. No great ventures. Now, I must go and find a man of an entirely different sort. Because the next name on my list did not make anything you can weigh, or ship, or put behind glass on a counter. He made a thing out of an idea. And I am told he cannot be seen before midnight. Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone. The first time I go to see him, it is about 11 o'clock in the morning. He is in bed. The second time, I think I will be cleverer. I go at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He is eating his breakfast, I am told, and I wait some time. When he comes in, he apologizes profusely for keeping me waiting. He is extremely polite, always anxious to render courtesy. I have met great men who wear their success badly. He does not. No one carries great success more gracefully. I tell him what I have come for, that I want to talk about success on behalf of young people, its underlying principles, and he throws back his large head and laughs. Nothing succeeds like success, he says. Then, success, did you say? Why, that is a big subject. Too big a one. You must give me time to think about it, he says. And you, having planted the seed in my brain, will have to wait for me. I ask what time I should call. Come any time, he says, if it is only late. I begin my work at about 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening and continue until 4 or 5 in the morning. Night is a more quiet time to work. It aids thought. So when I go to see him again, I make it a point to be late. He invites me into his studio, and we both sit down on a large and comfortable sofa, and he talks long on the subject of success. I wish I could put on paper the manner of him. He emphasizes everything with hands, head, and eyes, and his speech is beautifully distinct, due, a great deal, to his having given instruction to deaf mutes who must read the lips. Every word arrives finished. He has spent years being watched instead of heard, and it has made him the clearest speaker I have ever sat beside. I ask what he thinks are the factors of success. The reply is prompt and to the point. Perseverance is the chief, he says. But perseverance must have some practical end, or it does not avail the man possessing it. And then he says the hardest sentence of the night, and he says it without cruelty, as a physician states a diagnosis. A person without a practical end in view becomes a crank or an idiot. Such persons fill our insane asylums. The same perseverance that they show in some idiotic idea, he says, if exercised in the accomplishment of something practicable, would no doubt bring success. Perseverance is first, he says, but practicability is chief. The success of the Americans as a nation, he says, is due to their great practicability. I put it to him, but often what the world calls nonsensical becomes practical, does it not? You were called crazy too once, were you not? He does not take the compliment. He goes straight past it. There are some things, though, that are always impracticable, he says. Now take, for instance, this idea of perpetual motion. Scientists have proved that it is impossible, he says. Yet our patent office is continually beset by people applying for inventions on some perpetual motion machine. So the department has adopted a rule, he says, whereby a working model is always required of such applicants. They cannot furnish one. The impossible, he says, is incapable of success. That is the whole test, and it costs nothing to apply. Build the model. If the model will not run, You are not a genius ahead of your time. You are a man with a hobby that will eat your life. I say I have heard of people dreaming inventions. That is not at all impossible, he says. I am a believer in unconscious cerebration. The brain is working all the time, though we do not know it. At night, it follows up what we think in the daytime. When I have worked a long time on one thing, he says, I make it a point to bring all the facts regarding it together before I retire. And I have often been surprised at the results. Have you not noticed, he says, that often what was dark and perplexing to you the night before is found to be perfectly solved the next morning? We are thinking all the time, he says. It is impossible not to think. I ask him whether everyone can become an inventor. Oh no, he says. Not all minds are constituted alike. Some minds are only adapted to certain things. But as one's mind grows, he says, and one's knowledge of the world's industries widens, it adapts itself to such things as naturally fall to it. I ask him the relation of health to success. I believe it to be a primary principle of success, the professor replies. Mens sana in corpore sano, a sound mind in a sound body. The mind in a weak body, he says, produces weak ideas. A strong body gives strength to the thought of the mind. Then he gives me the image I will keep out of all of this. Ill health, he says, is due to man's artificiality of living. He lives indoors. He becomes, as it were, a hothouse plant. Such a plant is never as successful as a hardy garden plant is. An outdoor life is necessary to health and success, he says, especially in a youth. I press him. But is not hard study often necessary to success? No, he says. Decidedly not. You cannot force ideas. Successful ideas are the result of slow growth. Ideas do not reach perfection in a day, no matter how much study is put upon them. It is perseverance in the pursuit of studies that is really wanted, he says. Not force. Duration. Next, he says, must come concentration of purpose and study. That is another thing I mean to emphasize. Concentrate all your thought upon the work in hand. The sun's rays, he says, do not burn until brought to a focus. The sun's rays do not burn until brought to a focus. There is the whole doctrine of the man in 10 words at 2 o'clock in the morning on a sofa in a room full of wire and paper. And then he tells me what he is concentrating on now. And it is not the telephone. I am now thinking about flying machines, he says. Everything in regard to them I pick out and read. When I see a bird flying in the air, he says, I note its manner of flight, as I would not if I were not constantly thinking about artificial flight and concentrating all my thought and observation upon it. It is like a man, he says, who has made the acquaintance of some new word that has been brought forcibly to his notice, although he may have come across it many times before and not have noticed it particularly. That is the mechanism. Attention is not a virtue. Attention is an instrument, and it is pointed. And then he comes back, at the very end, to the thing that Marshall Field said to me across a mahogany desk on State Street with the gas coming up outside, and neither of these men has ever heard the other say it. Man is the result of slow growth, he says. That is why he occupies the position he does in animal life. What does a pup amount to, he says, that has gained its growth in a few days or weeks, beside a man who only attains it in as many years? A horse, he says, is often a grandfather before a boy has attained his full maturity. The most successful men in the end, he says, are those whose success is the result of steady accretion. Steady accretion. Field said, slow growing. Field said, there were never any great ventures or risks. Field said his turning point was a saved $5,000. And here, in a dark house across the country, at 3 in the morning, an inventor is telling me the same arithmetic in a different trade. That intellectuality is more vigorous, he says, that has attained its strength gradually. He is not finished. He has one more thing he wants to say about the man who advances step by step, and he is already leaning forward to say it.
So there is the ledger of Part 2. A clerk in 1857 watches a city die of its own credit and takes one lesson from it. Buy for cash, sell on 30 days. And that lesson holds through the fire of 71, the panic of 73, and every year after. $3.5 million burned, insurers blotted out, claims unpaid for years, and the house survives because when the worst arrived, Field owed nothing to anybody. And the turning point was never the fire. It was $5,000 a young man did not spend. Marden carried that arithmetic across the country and heard it again from a man who had never sold a yard of cloth in his life. Perseverance first. Practicability chief. Slow growth. Steady accretion. But Bell has not finished the thought. In Part 3, he takes it further than Field ever did, into what it costs a man to be held down and who does the holding. He says the mind must widen step by step until it can grasp any theme, any situation. He says a man who is not bound down is sure to succeed. And then he says, a man may be bound down. Chapter 3 begins at that window, with the sky going pale and a flock of young American geese,